Session 7, against publicly funded science, Dr. Terence Kealey, Vice-Chancellor, Buckingham University.
Thank you very much. Thank you. 2 or 3 people in this room have heard me give a very similar talk in the Oxford Libertarian Society earlier this week. So if they want to stand up and walk out, that's what I would do in their position. I hate to say this after the tone of the last 2 talks, but I bring good news. Here is the current Economist, and I'm going to read 4 paragraphs from page 90. When American politicians become chairmen of congressional committees, they are able to direct federal spending to their home states. So Richard Shelby, a Republican from Alabama, became chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee in 1997. Before then, Alabama averaged $6 million less in annual federal earmarks than the average state. Afterwards, they got $90 million more. Chairmanships are based on seniority. Appointments have little relationship to economic activity. So the chairman of these congressional, they change in America. Senators become the chairman of these committees on a completely arbitrary and random basis. Therefore, what these economists have done is that they've been able to look at a total of 232 completely random events over the last 4 decades. Over the last 4 decades, there have been 232 changes of chairman of important Senate and congressional committees. And these chairmen immediately have enormous power and can direct vast resources to their states. What happens? As everybody knows, on average, a state receives a 40 to 50% boost in earmarks, i.e. federal subsidies, following a chairman's appointment. This persists throughout the rest of his or her tenure. And the consequence, as we now know from these papers in today's Economist, is that private firms reacted by reducing capital expenditure by between 8 and 15%, and investment on R&D, research and development, by between 7 and 12%. Employment and sales growth also suffered. And an independent group of academics, one of them from the OECD, have confirmed in an independent study that a 1% rise of government consumption as a share of GDP eventually reduced private sector consumption by 1.9%, almost twice as much. Now, the reason this is good news is here we have really hard data from Harvard academics showing that federal support for states crowds out more private investment than would otherwise have been provided. That's to say, for every dollar the federal government gives to one of these states as one of these earmark deals, more than $1 is not spent by the private sector. The reason that's good news is we've all known for decades that that's the case. But once that knowledge is chronicled, and once everybody knows that every time your home senator becomes the chairman of one of these appropriations committees and sends $100 million to your state, everyone in that state will know that the consequence is that more than $100 million will not be spent by the private sector, and the state will therefore suffer. Now, those of you who unfortunately know me will know that I've been arguing now for over 20 years that the government funding of science is damaging because it crowds out more private funding than it does supply. And as some of you will know, this is a very old argument. It's over 400 years since an English lawyer called Francis Bacon, in his book, The Advancement of Learning, first suggested the modern dogma. Science, he said, is a public good. Anybody can go to the journals, anyone can go to the seminars, anyone can access someone else's science, copy it easily and cheaply, and therefore no rational entrepreneur will invest in research and development because his or her competitors can borrow the technology more cheaply than he or she had to spend to make it. Therefore, in a market, nobody will invest in research, and only if governments invest in research can there be economic growth. Economic growth is based on innovation. And in a market, so we've been told ever since Francis Bacon wrote 400 years ago, in a market, innovation is disincentivized by competitive pressure, and the brisker the market and the freer the market, the greater the disincentive, of course, and therefore it is only thanks to government that in a market you can get economic growth. This is a very important argument. It's called, rather pretentiously these days, post-neoclassical endogenous growth theory, and what it says is that economic growth in market economies can be attributed almost solely to government patronage of science. And therefore, if we as libertarians are going to capture one of the most important aspects of society of all, economic growth, we have to show that that argument is not true. Now, today's Economist, yesterday's Economist accurately, is a piece of evidence that shows it's not true. If in fact these senators, by sending $100 million home, have crowded out more than $100 million of private investment in research, then clearly it's not true. But that message has to get out. If you look at the history of the lead economic countries of the last, well, since Francis Bacon actually, if you look at who they were, it was first the Netherlands that led the world through the agricultural revolution, and then Britain that helped lead the world through the second part of the agricultural revolution, and then Britain that led the world through the industrial revolution, and then the United States that took over from Britain as the richest country in the world per capita about 1890, and has remained the richest country in the world per capita ever since amongst the big countries. What's interesting about those countries and the succession of those countries is that they were all laissez-faire in science. The British government simply did not invest in agricultural or industrial research at all. It just didn't do it until 1913. Even more interestingly, the United States government did not invest in research and developmental science until 1940, by when it had been the richest country in the world for 50 years, by when it had produced Edison and the Wright brothers, and a whole host of the technologies that made it so rich and so wealthy. At the same time, as we all know, the French and the Germans throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, their governments poured money into research and development. And yet, throughout the agricultural, industrial and post-industrial revolutions, France and Germany never caught up with the laissez-faire leaders. They grew economically, but they never converged. So the laissez-faire leader was the United Kingdom, and the only country that converged on the United Kingdom was equally laissez-faire America. And to give you an idea of how laissez-faire America was, when Smithson, who was an Englishman, a very unhappy Englishman, a very rich man but an unhappy one, when he left his money to the States to create the Smithsonian Institution, so determined was Congress not to spend money on research, the Smithsonian Institution, of course, being a science museum, that the money was actually refused, even though it was someone else's money, and it was put into some banks in Arkansas, where it lay for many, many years before, in the end, it was finally spent by Congress after half of the money that had been put in the banks in Arkansas had disappeared into the pockets of Arkansas politicians. So there's no historical evidence that the government funding of science has ever been an economic value. And there's no contemporary econometric evidence either. It's a very interesting study performed by the OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, published in 2003. You can get it on the web. It's called The Sources of Economic Growth in OECD Countries. And it simply looks at the OECD countries during the course of the history of that organization. Some have grown richer than others, at faster rates than others, and it's a correlative study. What government and other policies have correlated with which outcome? And what the study finds is that the private investment in R&D correlates very well with subsequent rates of economic growth. But there is simply no impact at all of public funding of R&D. There just is no positive impact at all. In fact, it might even damage, because the public funding of R&D crowds out the private funding, and it's the private funding that gives you economic growth. So even the OECD is warning that not only is the public funding of R&D, research and development, not economically beneficial, might even damage the enterprise. Now, why is this? Well, the answer is very simple. And I really will try to make sure I finish by 4:30 so that we really, like the previous speaker, so that we really keep to time. Science is not a public good. I ask you in this room, how many of you in this room could read a contemporary paper in the Journal of Molecular Biology? And those of you who could, how many of you who could read a paper in the Journal of Molecular Biology could read a paper in the Journal of Plasma Physics? These are contemporary papers. Let's look at really old-fashioned science. I mean, science that's over 100 years old. Everyone knows that science over 100 years old. I mean, that's the Dark Ages. It must be really easy reading papers that are 100 years old. Einstein's papers are over 100 years old. How many people in this room could read Einstein's papers? Actually, well, I see one person can, but you can't read the Journal of Molecular Biology. Science is actually only open to fellow scientists. And the numbers of people who can read a paper in a contemporary field are very, very few indeed. And the price you pay to be able to access those papers is to be publishing your own papers. Because if you're not publishing your own papers, you're not benchmarking your own knowledge against the cutting edge, and therefore you don't actually know what you do and don't know when you read other people's papers. And so science is no more a public good than is a market. It is actually a trade. If you want to read other people's papers from the common pool of papers, and there is a common pool of papers, you have to put your own papers into that common pool. Therefore, in my book, I call it an invisible college good because it's based on the original Royal Society, and the Royal Society was created for the very specific purpose of encouraging academics to share knowledge, to pool knowledge, because it's only those academics who pool knowledge that acquire the collective knowledge that's available to everyone by pooling their own research and getting out the research of others. It's only thus that science progresses, and the scientists who don't wish to pool knowledge get left behind. It has been shown by Edwin Mansfield and others that, contrary to myth, it costs about 60% of the original costs of invention to copy an established technology. So if someone comes along in Company A and creates a new technology, Company B in the same field costs them about 60% of the original costs just to copy, to acquire all the tacit knowledge of that particular discovery. Those are the marginal costs of copying. But on top of that, you have the sunk or average cost, because you can't copy unless you already have employed a corpus of scientists who are researching themselves to maintain their own cutting-edge knowledge, who are then in a position to work out which papers, which patents, which products to copy. Add those two costs together, and you discover that, contrary to myth, the costs of copying in toto are the same as the costs of innovation. It is no cheaper, on average, to copy than to innovate. And the anxiety that Francis Bacon had is simply not true. Science is not a public good, it's an extremely private good, but it is a sort of club good. It is the good of fellow people, fellow scientists, professionals within the same field, exchanging information either formally or informally, and paying a very high price to enter into the club. And even industrial scientists share knowledge. The rate of sharing of knowledge amongst researchers of competitive companies is about 30%. That's to say about 30% of all industrial innovation is the consequence of scientists of competing companies giving ideas to each other in exchange for other ideas, because scientists even from competing companies know that if they don't share their knowledge with other competing companies, they'll get left behind, because the competing company that doesn't share its knowledge will always have a smaller knowledge base than the companies that share. So to conclude and to keep to time, there is no historical evidence that the government funding of science has ever benefited a nation's economic growth. There's no contemporary econometric evidence either. Today's Economist confirms yet again that the government funding research and development merely crowds out its private funding and is less good economically. And the reason it doesn't work is that it's based on a myth. Science is not a public good. It's a form of private good that I call an invisible college good, and it costs as much to copy as to innovate. Thank you very much.
General session.
Right.